My brother looked me in the eye and told me the only reason I had stayed in that house for 20 years was because I was too afraid to find out what kind of life I could build on my own. My sister said I had used my own mother as a weapon to punish them for being happy. They said it standing in my kitchen, the kitchen I had been running since I was 9 years old. And when they finished, I turned off the stove, put down my spoon, and said, "Dinner is on the counter. Make sure she eats before it gets cold." Then I walked upstairs, and I fell apart where nobody could see me. And 3 days later, I was gone for good. My name is Renee, and I gave my family everything for 20 years. Everything. And the day I stopped, they called me a monster. If this is your first time here, welcome. Subscribe so you never miss a story. And before we go any further, drop a comment and tell me where you are watching from. I love seeing where our community is tuning in from around the world. Now let me take you back to the beginning. I grew up in a house that looked perfectly normal from the outside. A small brown brick home on a quiet street in a mid-sized town where everyone knew everyone, and nobody talked about what happened behind closed doors. We had a front yard with an oak tree. We had a mother who went to church every Sunday. We had a father who worked long hours and came home tired and expected dinner on the table and quiet in the house. From the outside, we were fine. From the inside, we were anything but. I was the oldest of 4 children. Below me was my brother Marcus, then my sister Diane, then the youngest, my brother Paul. And from the time I was old enough to understand what was expected of me, the message was clear. I was the responsible one. I was the one who set the example. I was the one who could handle things. My mother said it like it was a compliment. It took me until I was nearly 40 to understand it was never a compliment. It was an assignment. By the time I was 9 years old, I was waking up before school to make breakfast for my younger siblings. Not because my mother asked me to every morning, because it had simply become my job. She worked the early shift at a clothing factory across town, and my father did not do mornings. So I did. I stood at that stove in my school uniform, making oatmeal or toast or whatever we had, packing 3 lunch bags, making sure everyone had their shoes and their homework. Then I walked them to the bus stop and made sure we all got on. Then I went to school and tried to concentrate on being a child. I want you to sit with that for a moment. I was 9 years old, and I was already somebody's caretaker. Not because I chose it, because the adults in my life had decided, without ever saying the words out loud, that my needs were the ones that could wait, that my childhood was the one that could be borrowed from. And because I was 9 and I loved my family and I did not know any different, I said yes. I always said yes. I did not even know yet that no was an option. By the time I reached my teenage years, the role I had been handed as a child had hardened into something permanent. It was no longer something I did, it was something I was. The responsible one, the reliable one, the one you called when something went wrong. My siblings knew it. My parents knew it. The whole family knew it. And because nobody ever questioned it, I did not question it either. I just kept going. I kept showing up. I kept giving. Because that was what Renee did. When I was 13, my mother got sick for the first time. Nothing life-threatening, but serious enough that she was in bed for 3 weeks with a bad infection that would not clear up. My father handled it the way he handled most things that required emotional presence. He was absent. He went to work, came home, ate whatever I cooked, and went to bed. He did not ask how my mother was doing in any meaningful way. He did not ask how I was doing at all. So I ran the house. I cooked every meal. I did the laundry. I helped my siblings with homework. I sat with my mother in the evenings and brought her soup and made sure she took her medication. I was 13 years old, and I was running a household while going to school full-time. When my mother recovered, she hugged me and said she did not know what she would do without me. I remember feeling so proud in that moment, so needed, so important. And I understand now why that felt good. Because a child who is never told she is loved will take being needed as the closest substitute. It is not the same thing. It never was. But when you are 13 and starving for something that feels like warmth, being needed feels like enough. It was only years later that I understood I had been fed a replacement and told it was the real thing. High school came and went in a blur of responsibility. While my friends were going to parties and figuring out who they were and making the kinds of mistakes that teenagers are supposed to make, I was home, always home. My grades were good because school was the one place where my effort was returned to me directly. If I studied, I did well. It was the only area of my life where the exchange felt fair. Everything else I poured myself into disappeared into the family like water into dry ground. No trace, no return, just gone. When I was 17, a teacher named Ms. Carol Bennett changed my life. Not in the dramatic way you see in movies, where one conversation turns everything around. It was quieter than that. She pulled me aside after class one afternoon and handed me a brochure for a state university scholarship program for first-generation college students. She said she had been watching me all year. She said I had one of the sharpest minds she had seen in 20 years of teaching. She said if I applied and submitted a strong personal essay, she believed I had a real shot. I held that brochure on the bus ride home and felt something I had not felt in a very long time. I felt like someone had seen me. Not what I could do for them, just me. I filled out that application in secret. I worked on it for 3 weeks, staying late in the school library after everyone had gone home, writing and rewriting my personal essay until it said exactly what I wanted it to say. I wrote about resilience. I wrote about responsibility. I wrote about wanting to study nursing so I could build a real career and take care of myself for once in my life. It was the most honest thing I had ever put on paper. And when I finally submitted it and walked home through the cold November air, I felt something close to hope for the first time in years. I got the scholarship, a full ride to a state university 3 hours away in another part of Ohio. Tuition, housing, a small stipend for books and expenses, everything covered. Ms. Bennett hugged me when I told her. I cried standing right there in that hallway, holding the acceptance letter like it might disappear if I loosened my grip. I went home that evening with every intention of telling my family at dinner. I had rehearsed what I would say on the drive home. I sat down at that kitchen table, looked around at my mother and my father and my 3 siblings, took a breath, and opened my mouth. My mother spoke first. She had been to the doctor that afternoon. Her blood pressure had gotten dangerously high, and the doctor wanted her on new medication and strict rest for at least 2 months. She looked exhausted sitting there under the kitchen light. She did not know what I was holding in my jacket pocket. She did not know what I was about to say. And I looked at her tired face, and I made a decision in the space of about 4 seconds that would shape the next 20 years of my life. I said nothing about the scholarship. I asked my mother what the doctor had said, and I listened and I nodded, and I told her we would figure it out together. I deferred my acceptance the next morning. Just 1 year, I told myself, until things settled down. That year became 2, then 5. Then the scholarship expired and the window closed, and the version of Renee who was going to study nursing and build a life 3 hours away in Ohio quietly ceased to exist. Nobody in my family ever knew she had existed at all. By the time I turned 23, my siblings had all moved on. Marcus got a job offer in Atlanta and took it without a second thought. He called home on holidays and birthdays, and that was about it. Diane met a man named Robert at a community college class she was taking and married him within a year and moved 40 minutes away to his side of town. She was close enough to visit, but somehow never did. Paul, the youngest, got a basketball scholarship to a college in Tennessee and left at 18 with 2 duffel bags and a brand new future. I helped him pack. I stood on the porch and waved as my father drove him to the airport. Then I went back inside and washed the breakfast dishes and started thinking about what to make for dinner. Nobody asked me if I was okay. Nobody noticed that they were all leaving and I was still there. It was simply assumed that Renee would stay. It had always been assumed. And because I had spent my entire life meeting the assumptions people made about me, I stayed. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself I was just waiting for the right moment to figure out my own life. But the right moment kept getting pushed further away by the next thing that needed handling, and the next, and the next. And slowly, so slowly, I barely noticed it happening. My 20s started to disappear the same way my teenage years had. One quiet sacrifice at a time. My mother's health continued to go up and down like a tide. Good months followed by bad ones. I became her unofficial caretaker without anyone ever officially asking me to take on that role. I drove her to doctor appointments. I picked up her prescriptions from the Walgreens on 5th. I sat with her during the bad weeks when she did not want to be alone. My father was present in the physical sense of the word. He lived in the house. He sat in his recliner and watched the evening news and ate the dinners I cooked. But emotionally, he had checked out of the family long before I was old enough to understand what that meant. He was not cruel. He was simply absent in the way that some men of his generation had been taught they were allowed to be. And so the emotional weight of the household, all of it, lived with me. I did eventually get a job, an administrative position at a small insurance company downtown, the kind of job that paid enough to get by, but not enough to get ahead. I was good at it, organized, detail-oriented, calm under pressure. My boss used to joke that I could run the whole office if I wanted to. I used to laugh along with her. But the truth was, I could not run my own life, let alone an office. Every decision I made, every dollar I saved, every plan I tried to build was filtered through the question of what my family needed first. There was never enough left over for Renee. I met Daniel when I was 27. He came into my life the way good things sometimes do when you are not looking for them. He was a friend of a coworker who showed up at an after-work birthday dinner at a restaurant downtown, sat across from me, and spent the whole evening making me laugh harder than I had laughed in years. He was kind in that quiet, steady way that is hard to find. Not flashy, not trying to impress anyone, just genuinely warm and present and interested in who I was as a person. He asked me questions about myself that nobody in my daily life ever thought to ask. What did I want? What did I dream about? What made me happy? I remember sitting there thinking, I did not even know how to answer those questions anymore. But he waited while I figured it out. He always waited. We dated for 2 years, and they were the best 2 years I had experienced as an adult. Daniel had a small apartment on the east side of town, and on the evenings I was not needed at home, I would go there and we would cook dinner together and watch movies and just sit in the kind of comfortable quiet that you only find with someone who genuinely knows you. For the first time in my adult life, I felt like a person and not just a function. I felt like someone whose presence mattered beyond what she could provide. Daniel used to tell me I deserved to be taken care of for once. I used to brush it off because I did not know how to receive that. I know now that I should have listened. He proposed on a Tuesday evening in his kitchen. No big production, no fancy restaurant, just the two of us after dinner. Him down on one knee with a simple gold ring he had saved up for, telling me I was the most remarkable woman he had ever known, and he wanted to spend his life making sure I knew that every day. I said yes before he finished the sentence. I called my mother from his apartment that night, voice shaking with happiness, and told her I was engaged. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said she was happy for me. Then she said she had been having chest pains and had not wanted to worry me, but maybe I should come home. I went home that night, and the chest pains turned into a hospital stay, and the hospital stay turned into a procedure, and the procedure turned into 6 weeks of recovery. And somewhere inside those 6 weeks, Daniel and I stopped talking about wedding dates and started talking about postponing. We postponed once, then twice. Then Daniel sat me down one evening and told me something that I have never forgotten. He said he loved me and he was not going anywhere, but he needed me to understand that he could not spend his life being the thing I chose after everyone else had been taken care of. He said he needed to be a priority sometimes, not always, just sometimes. I told him he was, but we both knew that was not true. And 18 months later, on a rainy Wednesday evening, we ended things in the parking lot of the same restaurant where we had met. He hugged me for a long time before he got in his car. I drove home and made my mother's dinner and did not tell anyone what had happened. Nobody asked. What happened in the days that followed is something I have turned over in my mind many times since. Marcus flew in from Atlanta the day after the funeral arrangements were made. He arrived looking polished and out of place, like a man who had been living a comfortable life and had briefly stepped out of it to attend to something unpleasant. He hugged me at the door and said, "I must be exhausted." I said I was fine. He nodded like that settled it and went to sit with my mother in the living room. Diane drove up with Robert and immediately started asking questions about the will and the house and what the plan was going forward. Not in a cruel way, just in the way of someone who had been absent so long that she had no idea how much there was to actually manage, and assumed it could all be sorted out over a long weekend. Paul flew in from Tennessee and was genuinely grief-stricken and kind, but was back on a plane to his family within 4 days because his kids had school and his wife needed him home. I arranged the funeral. I chose the casket and the flowers and the readings. I coordinated with the pastor and the funeral home and the caterer for the reception afterward. I called relatives I had not spoken to in years and gave them the details. I wrote my father's obituary sitting at the kitchen table at 2 a.m. because nobody else had thought to do it. I managed my mother through her grief while managing my own. And when the funeral was over and the relatives had gone home, and the dishes from the reception had been washed and put away, Marcus and Diane and Paul all left within 2 days of each other. Back to Atlanta, back to Robert's side of town, back to Tennessee. And I stood on that porch again, the same porch I had stood on when Paul left for college all those years ago, and watched them go. Nobody asked me what I needed. Nobody sat down with me and said, "Renee, you have been carrying this alone for a long time. What can we do?" Nobody suggested we figure out a more equitable arrangement for Mom's care going forward. It was simply assumed, the way everything had always been assumed, that I would continue, that I would manage, that I was fine, because Renee was always fine. And what made it worse was that this was not the first time I had watched them leave. They had each built lives that allowed them to show up for the big moments, the funerals, the crises, the occasions that required presence, and then disappear again just as quickly, back to their comfortable distances, leaving me to handle everything that came after. The flowers dying on the grave, the thank you notes that needed writing, the mother who cried quietly in the kitchen at night when she thought no one could hear her. I heard her. I always heard her, because I was always there. The anger that had been building quietly for years moved up a little higher in my chest that week. It was no longer just below the surface. It was right there, just behind my eyes, every single day. I swallowed it the way I had always swallowed it, but it was getting harder to keep down. 3 weeks after the funeral, my mother came to me in the kitchen one evening while I was doing the dishes and told me she did not know what she would do without me. She meant it kindly, I know she did. But I stood at that sink with my hands in the warm, soapy water, and I felt nothing. Not warmth, not pride, not the satisfaction I used to feel as a child when those words made me feel needed and important. Just nothing. And that emptiness scared me more than the anger had. Because anger means you still care enough to feel something. Nothing means something else entirely. Nothing means you are running out. I turned 40 in that same house, with a small cake my mother bought from the grocery store bakery, and a phone call from each of my siblings. Marcus called from Atlanta and sang happy birthday in the distracted way of someone multitasking. Diane texted a GIF with balloons on it. Paul called in the evening, and we talked for about 12 minutes before his youngest started crying in the background, and he had to go. I sat at that kitchen table after my mother went to bed and looked at the candles she had put on the cake. 4 of them, because she could not find a 0. And I made myself a promise. I told myself that 40 was the line, that whatever came next was going to include me, that I was going to stop waiting for permission to live my own life and start building one. I did not know yet how hard my family was going to make that. The first thing I did was look into going back to school. It had been over 20 years since I had deferred that scholarship and walked away from nursing, but the desire had never fully left me. I found a licensed practical nursing program at a community college 40 minutes away that ran in the evenings and on weekends. 18 months. I could keep my job during the day and study at night and on weekends. It was going to be hard, but it was manageable. I filled out the application at my desk at work during my lunch break, the same way I had filled out that scholarship application in the school library all those years ago. Quietly, in secret, hoping this time things would be different. I got in. I paid the first semester deposit out of my own savings, money I had been setting aside in small amounts for years with no specific plan, just a feeling that someday I might need it for something that mattered. I told my mother 2 weeks before the program started. I explained the schedule carefully. I told her I had arranged for a home health aide to come 3 afternoons a week to cover the times I would be in class. I had already called the agency. I had already handled it. I just needed her to know. She listened, and then she was quiet for a moment. And then she said she supposed that was fine, but she hoped I was not going to stretch myself too thin. I said I would be okay. I believed it when I said it. I called Marcus that same week to let him know about the new arrangement, not to ask permission, but just to keep him informed. He listened and then said he hoped I knew what I was taking on. I said I did. He said if it got to be too much, I should let him know. I asked him directly, for the first time in my life, whether he might be able to contribute financially to the home health aid, since it was an added expense. There was a pause on the line that lasted just a little too long. Then he said things were tight right now with the new house he and his wife had just bought in a nice neighborhood outside Atlanta. I said I understood. I hung up and sat with that for a long time. Diane called me 2 days later. I do not know if Marcus had spoken to her, or if she had sensed something shifting from a distance, the way people sometimes do when the person they have always relied on starts to pull back even slightly. She said she had heard I was starting school, and she just wanted to make sure Mom was going to be okay. Not whether I was going to be okay, whether Mom was going to be okay. I told her the arrangements I had made. She said the home health aid situation made her nervous, and she was not sure a stranger in the house was the right call. I asked her what alternative she was suggesting. She said she would have to think about it. She never called back with an answer. What she did instead was call my mother and plant a seed of worry that took root almost immediately. Within a week, my mother was anxious about the aid and asking me every other day whether we really needed her and whether I was sure I had time for school and whether everything was going to be all right. The resistance had not come at me directly. It had come the way resistance in families often does, sideways, through the person least equipped to push back. I started the program anyway. I showed up on the first evening with my notebook and my textbooks and sat in that classroom full of people younger than me and felt something I had not felt in a very long time. I felt like myself, not a caretaker, not a daughter, not the responsible one. Just a woman in a classroom learning something she had wanted to learn for 20 years. I cried in my car after that first class, not from sadness, from something that was almost its opposite, from the strange and overwhelming feeling of arriving somewhere you should have been a long time ago. I made it through 4 months of that program, 4 months of early mornings and late nights and weekends split between studying and managing the house and keeping everything running. 4 months of feeling like I was finally building something. And then my mother fell. A simple fall in the bathroom on a Tuesday evening, a broken wrist and a badly bruised hip. Nothing life-threatening, but serious enough that she needed more care than the aid could provide. Serious enough that the program I had enrolled in, the one I had saved for and planned for and fought quietly for, had to be put on hold. I called the college and requested a leave of absence. The woman on the phone was kind about it. I thanked her and hung up and sat in my car in the hospital parking lot for a very long time. I did not cry. I was past crying about things like this. I just sat there in the dark and felt the last ember of that particular hope go out. My mother recovered from the fall over the following 3 months. Slowly and with a great deal of help, most of it from me. By the time she was fully mobile again, I was 42 years old, and something inside me had quietly and permanently reorganized itself. I cannot point to a single moment when it happened. It was not dramatic. It was more like a slow, geological shift, the kind that happens deep underground over a long period of time, until one day the surface looks completely different, and you realize the change had been happening long before you noticed it. I was still showing up, still cooking and cleaning and managing and coordinating, but I was doing it from a different place inside myself, not from love or duty or even habit, from a kind of hollow automaticity. My hands knew what to do, so they kept doing it. But the part of me that used to believe it mattered had gone very quiet. I started therapy that year. a woman named Dr. Sandra Holloway, who had an office above a bookstore on Clement Street, and who had the particular gift of asking simple questions that opened up very complicated things. She asked me in our third session to describe what a normal Tuesday looked like for me. I described it. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said something I have never forgotten. She said, "It sounded like I had been living my life as a resource rather than a person." I did not say anything back. I just sat with those words in that small, warm office above the bookstore and felt them land somewhere true. A resource rather than a person. That was exactly it. That was exactly what had happened to me. And the fact that someone had seen it and named it so precisely made something in me simultaneously break open and begin to heal. Dr. Holloway did not tell me what to do. That is not what good therapists do. But over the months that followed, she helped me see my situation with a clarity I had never allowed myself before. She helped me see that the role I played in my family had never been assigned to me because I was the most capable. It had been assigned to me because I had been the most willing to accept it without complaint. She helped me see that my siblings were not bad people, but they were people who had been allowed, by my own endless accommodation, to never have to grow into the discomfort of responsibility. She helped me see that my mother loved me in the way she knew how, but had also, perhaps without fully realizing it, leaned into my availability in a way that had cost me enormously. And she helped me see that none of this was going to change on its own. That if I wanted something different, I was going to have to do something different. That the life I wanted was not going to arrive while I kept making it so easy for everyone else to take the one I had. I started making changes slowly, small ones at first. I stopped answering phone calls after 9 in the evening. I started taking one Saturday afternoon a month entirely for myself. No errands, no appointments, no family obligations. I started saying, I need to check my schedule before automatically saying yes to things. These were tiny shifts by any objective measure, but the reaction they produced was not tiny at all. My mother noticed immediately and asked if everything was okay with me. Marcus called out of nowhere one Sunday and said he had heard I seemed stressed and he hoped I was not burning out. Diane stopped by the house unannounced one evening, something she had not done in years, and spent most of the visit watching me with an expression I could not quite read. Nobody said directly that they were unsettled by the new version of me, but their attention, which had been so consistently absent for so long, suddenly reappeared the moment I began to pull back even slightly. And that told me everything I needed to know. My mother's sister, my Aunt Bev, was visiting from out of state that October, and the whole family had been invited to a dinner at Diane's house. Marcus flew in from Atlanta and stayed at a hotel nearby. Paul drove up from Tennessee for the weekend and was staying at Diane's with Robert's spare room. It was the first time all 4 of us had been in the same place since our father's funeral, and there was something both familiar and deeply strange about sitting around a table together again. Familiar because we were family, and family carries a particular gravity no matter how much distance grows between people. Strange because I looked around that table and realized I knew almost nothing about who my siblings had become in the years since we had all lived under the same roof. We had stayed connected in the way that people stay connected when they do not want to do the actual work of staying close. Holidays, birthdays, crises, everything in between, handled by me alone. After dinner, the conversation turned to my mother's care and what the plan was going forward as she got older and needed more support. And I sat there and listened, while Marcus and Diane and Paul discussed options and timelines and resources, as if the person who had been providing all of that care was not sitting right there among them. As if I was not a person with a life and limits and needs of my own, but simply an existing arrangement that could be expected to continue indefinitely. Marcus said he thought the current setup was working well. Diane agreed. Paul said he wished he could do more from Tennessee, but the distance made it hard. And then Diane looked at me across the table and said she just wanted to make sure I was okay with continuing to handle things the way I had been. Not whether I wanted to, whether I was okay with it. As if my consent was a formality, as if the answer was already known. I said I was not okay with it, quietly, without raising my voice. I said I had not been okay with it for a very long time, and I needed things to change. The table went still. My mother looked at me with an expression I had never seen on her face before, something between surprise and hurt. Marcus cleared his throat. Diane set down her fork. Paul looked at the table. And in the silence that followed, I understood that my family had never once prepared themselves for the possibility that I might stop. That it had genuinely never occurred to them that I had a breaking point, because I had never shown them one. Because I had spent 42 years making sure they never had to see it. And now that they were seeing it, they did not know what to do with it. So they did what people do when the thing they have always relied on suddenly reveals itself to be something that can run out. They got scared. And scared people, in my experience, do not respond with gratitude. They respond with pressure. The drive home from Diane's house that evening was the quietest my mother and I had ever been together in a car. Marcus went back to his hotel. Paul stayed at Diane's. And I drove my mother home through the dark streets with her sitting in the passenger seat with her purse on her lap and her hands folded on top of it, looking straight ahead the whole way. I did not try to fill the silence. I was done filling silences that other people created. When I pulled into the driveway and turned off the engine, she sat there for a moment before getting out. And then she said, without looking at me, that she hoped I was not planning to do anything rash. I asked her what she meant by rash. She said she just meant she hoped I was not going to make any big decisions while I was feeling emotional. I sat with that for a second. Then I got out of the car and helped her inside and said goodnight and went to my room and closed the door. Marcus flew back to Atlanta 2 days later, or so I thought. Paul drove back to Tennessee the morning after that, and the house settled back into its familiar quiet. Just my mother and me, the same way it always had. Except that this time, something was different. This time, I had said the thing out loud. And you cannot unsay a thing once it is out in the world. It lives there. It changes the air. And as I sat in my room that night, listening to the house settle around me, I understood that everything that came next was going to be different from everything that had come before. I had cracked the door open, and I was not going to let it close again. I did not expect them to take it well, but I did not expect what actually happened either. Nothing in 20 years of managing this family had prepared me for what came through that front door on a Wednesday evening 3 days after the dinner at Diane's house. I was in the kitchen making my mother's dinner when I heard the car in the driveway. I looked out the window and felt my stomach drop. It was Marcus's rental car, and pulling in right behind him was Diane's silver SUV. I had not been told they were coming. Nobody had called. Nobody had asked if it was a good time. They had simply decided, the way they had always decided things that involved me, that they were coming, and that was that. I turned back to the stove and kept stirring because my hands needed something to do, and because I had learned a long time ago that the best way to walk into a hard conversation was from a place of stillness. My mother was in the living room when they came in. I heard the greetings, the hugs, the how was the drive, the you look good. I heard my mother's voice lift the way it always did when her other children showed up. That particular brightness she reserved for the ones who came rarely, and therefore carried the shine of occasion. I did not begrudge her that. I understood it. I just noticed it. The way you notice things when you have been the one who is always there and have watched your presence become invisible precisely because of its consistency. Marcus came into the kitchen first. He leaned against the counter with his arms crossed and looked at me the way he used to look at me when we were children, and he thought I had done something wrong. He said he and Diane had talked, and they felt it was important to come in person because what was happening was too serious for a phone call. I said I was listening. He said, "Renee, we are worried about you. We think something has shifted in you, and we do not think it is healthy." I asked him to be specific about what he meant by shifted. He said I had become bitter, that I was looking at everything the family had ever done through a dark lens and rewriting history to make myself the victim. He said as far as he could see, I had always been the one who wanted to be in control of everything. And now that Mom was getting older and things were changing, I was using that as an excuse to blow everything up. I kept stirring. I did not look at him. I said, "Marcus, I am going to need you to say what you actually came here to say." And that was when he said it. He said, "Renee, I think you resent us. I think you have always resented us. I think you resented me for going to Atlanta and building a good life. I think you resented Diane for getting married. I think you resented Paul for getting that scholarship. And instead of dealing with that resentment like an adult, you stayed in this house and fed it for 20 years until it turned into whatever this is." He gestured around the kitchen when he said whatever this is, like the room itself was evidence of my dysfunction. He said, "I think you are jealous. I think you have always been jealous of the lives we built while you stood here telling yourself you were sacrificing, when really you just did not have the courage to leave." The spoon in my hand went still. The kitchen was completely quiet, except for the sound of something simmering on the stove. I did not turn around. I did not trust my face in that moment. I stood with my back to my brother, and I breathed, and I let those words move through me, and I did not give him the reaction he had come there looking for. Diane came in from the living room then. She must have been listening from the doorway, because she walked in like someone who had been waiting for her cue. She put her purse on the counter, and she looked at me with an expression I can only describe as pity mixed with accusation. And she said, "Renee, I am going to say something, and I need you to hear it as someone who loves you." I said, "Go ahead." She said, "I think you have made yourself a martyr in this family for so long that you do not know who you are without that role. She said, "I think you stayed in this house not because we needed you, but because leaving would have meant finding out what kind of life you could actually build on your own. And that terrified you." She said, "You have spent 20 years making all of us feel guilty for living our lives. And I am sorry, but I am not going to feel guilty anymore." She paused, and then she said the thing that I will carry with me for the rest of my life. She said, "Honestly, Renee, the way you are acting right now, using Mom as a pawn to punish us for being happy, it is cruel. It is genuinely cruel. And I did not think you were capable of it. But here we are. You have become someone I do not recognize, someone none of us recognize. And that is not our fault. That is yours." I heard my mother shift in the living room. I do not know how much she heard. I hope not all of it. I put the spoon down on the counter very carefully. I turned off the burner. I turned around and I looked at my brother and my sister in the kitchen I had run since I was 9. And I looked at them for a long moment without saying anything. And then I said, very quietly, "The dinner is on the stove. Make sure she eats before it gets cold." And I walked out of the kitchen and down the hallway and up the stairs and into my room, and I closed the door. I made it to the edge of my bed before my legs gave out. I sat down and I pressed both hands over my mouth, and I wept in a way I had not wept since I was a child. Not delicate crying, the kind that comes from somewhere so deep it has no sound at first, just shaking, just your whole body trying to process something that your mind cannot hold. I wept for the scholarship I gave up, for Daniel in that parking lot in the rain, for every Saturday morning I spent scrubbing those stairs, for every birthday that passed without anyone asking what I wanted, for every version of myself I had quietly buried to keep that family running. And I wept because my brother had stood in my kitchen and called me jealous and cowardly, and my sister had called me cruel, and neither of them had been in that house, not really, not for any of it, and yet they had walked in here and rewritten the entire story in about 10 minutes and expected me to accept it as the truth. I cried until there was nothing left. And then I sat there in the quiet of my room with my hands in my lap and my face swollen and my chest hollowed out, and I felt something settle inside me, something cold and clear and absolute. I was done. Not in the way I had been thinking about being done for months, carefully and with conditions, and always with one eye on what everyone else needed. I mean done, completely, without reservation, without guilt, without any remaining question about whether I was making the right decision. They had come into my house to tell me I was jealous and cruel and a coward, and in doing so, they had given me the one thing I had been missing for months: complete clarity. I was leaving, and nothing they said or did from this point forward was going to change that. I heard them leave about an hour later. I heard Marcus's rental car back out of the driveway. I heard Diane's SUV follow. I heard my mother move slowly from the living room to the kitchen, and I heard the sound of a pot being lifted and a bowl being set on the counter. She had heated her own dinner. For the first time in longer than I could remember, she had taken care of herself. And I sat on the edge of my bed in the dark, and I thought, yes, yes, they can all do this. They just never had to, because I was always here. But I am not always going to be here anymore. And that is not cruelty. That is the most honest thing I have ever done for this family. Even if they never understand it, even if they never forgive me for it, it is the truth. And I am done living any other way. I gave myself 2 weeks to prepare. Not because I needed 2 weeks to pack. I did not have much that was truly mine after a lifetime of living inside other people's needs, but because I wanted to make sure my mother had everything she needed before I walked out that door. I was not going to leave chaos behind me, no matter what had been said in that kitchen. That was not who I was. Whatever Marcus and Diane believed about me, whatever story they had constructed to make my leaving into something ugly, I was going to do this right. I was going to do it the way I had done everything in my life, thoroughly, carefully, without anyone being able to say I had not thought it through. I called the Home Health Aid Agency and arranged for full-time coverage starting the first of the following month. I paid the first month myself out of my savings. Then I put together everything my mother's caregivers would need in a single document. Her medication list, her doctor's contact information, her insurance details, her dietary restrictions, the name and number of her pharmacy, the days and times of her upcoming appointments. I organized her medications in a blue basket on the kitchen counter, with a printed schedule taped to the inside of the cabinet above it. I made sure the house was fully stocked. I fixed the loose hinge on the bathroom door that I had been meaning to fix for months. I changed the burnt-out bulb in the hallway. I left nothing undone. I did not call Marcus or Diane. After what had happened in that kitchen, I was not ready to hear either of their voices, and I did not trust myself to speak to them without saying things I could not take back. So I did what the situation required, and I kept my dignity intact at the same time. I sent them each a text message with the agency's contact information, Patricia's name and schedule, the monthly cost I expected them to split, and a note that said all further questions about Mom's care should go to Patricia directly or to her doctor's office. It was not warm. It was not hostile. It was just information. The kind of clear, organized, practical communication I had been providing to that family my entire life. Except this time, it came from a distance, and it came on my terms. Paul was the only one I called. We spoke for almost an hour the evening before I left. He had not been at the confrontation, and when I told him what Marcus and Diane had said, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said he was sorry. Not in the deflecting way people sometimes apologize for things they did not do. In the genuine way of someone who understood that being sorry was not enough, but was the only honest place to start. He asked if there was anything he could do. I told him the best thing he could do was stay in contact with our mother and show up for her in the ways he was able to from Tennessee. He said he would. I believed him. Marcus reached out first, about 8 months after I left. A text message that said he had been doing a lot of thinking and he owed me a conversation when I was ready. I was not ready for another 2 months. When I finally called him back, we talked for a long time, and it was not easy, and there were things said that required a level of honesty that our family had never practiced before. He did not fully take back what he said in that kitchen, but he acknowledged that he had said it from a place of fear and defensiveness, and that fear and defensiveness did not make it true. It was not the apology I had imagined in my better moments, or the confrontation I had rehearsed in my worse ones. It was just two people trying to find their way back to something workable from a very long distance. We are cordial now, carefully, deliberately cordial. It is not the sibling relationship I used to wish we had, but it is honest, and I have learned to value honesty over comfort. Diane and I took longer. We did not speak for nearly 10 months, and when we did, it was stilted and careful, in the way of two people walking across ice they are not sure will hold. She has never directly apologized for what she said in that kitchen, but she started showing up at my mother's house on Saturday afternoons about 6 months ago, something she was apparently capable of all along, but had never been asked to do in a direct and non-negotiable way. I choose to read that as her version of an apology. Some people cannot say the words, but they can change the behavior. I am learning to accept that as enough, even when it does not feel like enough. We are not close. We may never be close, but we are family, and we are trying, and some days that has to be sufficient. Paul and I are probably the closest we have ever been. He was not there for what happened in that kitchen, and I think that preserved something between us that might otherwise have been damaged beyond repair. He calls our mother twice a week from Tennessee and has booked flights for the whole family to come up for a visit in the summer. He called me on my birthday this year, and we talked for 2 hours. No kids crying in the background, no rushing off. Just two people who share a history, finally taking the time to actually know each other. I did not realize until those 2 hours how much I had missed him, how much I had missed the version of our relationship that existed before distance and assumption and the exhaustion of my own life had gotten between us. My mother said something to me on the phone a few weeks ago that I have been thinking about ever since. She said she was proud of me. I asked her what she meant. She said she meant she was proud of the way I had handled everything, the way I had always handled everything. And then she paused and said she supposed she had not always made it easy for me to have my own life, and she was sorry for that. It was not a grand apology. It was quiet and a little awkward, and she moved on to other things pretty quickly after she said it. But I have held on to it, because it was real. And real, even when it is small, is everything. I went back to the community college 6 months after I moved out. I re-enrolled in the licensed practical nursing program, and I am now in my final semester. I go to class 3 evenings a week and on Saturday mornings, and I sit in that classroom with my notebook and my textbooks, and I feel, every single time, like I am exactly where I am supposed to be. My instructor told me last month that I am one of the strongest students in the cohort. I thanked her, and then I went to my car, and I sat there for a few minutes, just letting that land. Not brushing it off, not deflecting. Just letting someone's recognition of me settle into the place inside where recognition belongs. I am still learning how to do that. To receive. To let good things in without immediately redirecting them towards someone else. It is harder than it sounds when you have spent a lifetime doing the opposite. I am 44 years old, and I am in nursing school. And I have an apartment with morning light and herb pots on the balcony, and a Sunday phone call with my mother and siblings, who are trying in the ways they know how, even when those ways fall short. I am not living the life I imagined at 17, when I held that scholarship brochure on the bus ride home. That life is gone, and I have made my peace with that. But I am living a life that is mine, fully and without apology. And that is something I was not sure I would ever be able to say. If you have been the one in your family who always stayed, always gave, always handled everything while everyone else built their lives and moved forward, I want you to hear this. Your needs are not less important because you are capable. Your life is not less valuable because you have spent it taking care of others. And choosing yourself, finally and without apology, is not selfish. It is survival. It is sanity. It is the most honest thing you may ever do. You do not need permission. You never did. You just need to decide. And if Renee's story has shown you anything today, I hope it has shown you that it is never too late to make that decision, no matter how long you have been waiting. If this story moved you, please give it a like. It helps more people find their way to these stories. Leave a comment below and tell me what part of Renee's journey stayed with you the most. And drop your location in the comments. I love seeing where our community is watching from around the world. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribe if you have not already, so you never miss a story. Until next time, take care of yourself. You deserve that. You always have.